December 16th, 1944. 05:30 hours. Along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest, the silence of a frozen winter morning was shattered by the muzzle flashes of 1,600 German guns. Searchlights bounced their beams off the low clouds, painting the snow with a pale, artificial moonlight. Boys from Pennsylvania, Indiana, and West Virginia, many of them in their first real winter under arms, stared into the dark and wondered if the war was finally coming to find them. It was, but the story you are about to hear is not about that German barrage. It is about the answer the Americans gave back. It is about how, in 1944 and 1945, in fog so thick a man could lose his own squad, in snow that buried foxholes overnight, on roads where every footprint betrayed a column, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht discovered something terrifying. There was no place to hide. Not in a tree line, not in a cellar, not behind a ridge, not even in the white silence of a winter forest. American artillery would find them anyway. 8 days after that opening German bombardment, on the icy banks of the Sauer River near the Luxembourg border town of Echternach, an entire German battalion learned this lesson in a way no one in the German army had ever experienced before. They had crept toward the river under cover of darkness, hoping to slip across in rubber boats and over a small wooden footbridge. American observers on the heights above could not see them with the naked eye. The night was too black. The fog clung to the water. But that did not matter, because the shells the Americans were firing did not need to see anything at all. They were listening. In a letter written soon after, General George Patton, commander of the United States Third Army, sat down to describe what had happened to the Chief of Army Ordnance in Washington. He chose his words carefully, because what he was describing was still one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. He wrote, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. He went on, "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." Then he added a single sentence that captured the new and ugly arithmetic of the Western Front. "I am glad that you all thought of it first." This is the story of why the Germans could not hide from American artillery, even in winter. It is the story of a weapon system so layered, so industrial, and so quietly intelligent that by the last winter of the Second World War, the German soldier had begun to feel that the very sky above him was watching, calculating, and waiting to kill him. And it begins, as so many wartime stories do, not on the battlefield, but in factories, classrooms, and laboratories, far from the sound of any gun. The American field artillery that arrived in Europe by the autumn of 1944 was not, on paper, a weapon of revolutionary numbers. It was, instead, a system. Every standard United States infantry division in the European theater carried into battle a small kingdom of cannon. 3 battalions, each fielding 12 M2A1 105mm howitzers, were attached one to each of the division's 3 infantry regiments. A 4th battalion of 12 M1 155mm howitzers stood ready in general support, 48 tubes for one division. More than 2,000 men devoted entirely to the science of putting steel on a target. And inside each regiment another 6 short-barreled 105mm pieces in the cannon company, ready to fire at closer ranges. The M2A1 was the workhorse. It weighed about 5,000 pounds. It could throw a 33-pound high-explosive shell to a maximum range of just over 12,000 yards. A trained crew of 9 could fire as many as 10 rounds in a single minute in a short burst, with a sustained rate of 3 to 4. The Americans built more than 8,500 of them during the war. By the end of the conflict, the 105mm high-explosive round from this single weapon was the most fired field artillery shell in the United States Army's entire arsenal. Behind the divisions stood the corps-level guns. The M1 155mm, known to every gunner in the Army as the Long Tom, could throw a 100-pound shell almost 14 miles. First fired in combat in North Africa on Christmas Eve of 1942, by the time of the Battle of the Bulge, more than 30 battalions of these heavy guns were in the European and Mediterranean theatres. Heavier still was the 8-inch howitzer, a piece of unusual accuracy, fed with 200-pound projectiles, used to demolish bridges, bunkers, and stone churches turned into German strongpoints. And above them all, rare and feared, sat the largest field piece the United States deployed in the war, the M1 240mm howitzer, nicknamed the Black Dragon. Weighing 64,000 pounds, it had to be moved in two pieces and assembled at its firing position by crane. It could hurl a 360-pound shell more than 14 miles. The Americans built only 315 of them. 15 battalions reached the European theatre. When one fired, men miles away looked up at the sound, because nothing else on the battlefield made that noise. But the guns themselves were only the visible part of the iceberg. The truly decisive American advantages lay hidden inside the system that controlled them, and the architect of that system was a man most American civilians have never heard of, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. McNair was an artilleryman. He had finished 11th in his West Point class of 1904. He had served as Chief of Artillery Training in the American Expeditionary Forces in 1918. From March of 1942 to July of 1944, he commanded Army Ground Forces, the organization responsible for raising, training, and equipping nearly every soldier the United States sent overseas. McNair never lived to see the Battle of the Bulge. He was killed by an errant Allied bomb near St. Lo on July 25, 1944, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theatre. But the doctrine he left behind would do more to kill Germans in the winter of 1944 than any single weapon ever fielded. McNair's central idea was the Fire Direction Center. In the German army, in the British army, in every army before this point, an artillery battery generally fired its own missions on its own targets, registered its own guns, and worked largely independently. McNair's reforms, refined at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill in Oklahoma during the 1930s, centralized fire control at the battalion level. A single team of officers and enlisted computers, working with maps, slide rules, and graphical firing tables, could take a single grid coordinate phoned in by a forward observer and, within minutes, deliver coordinated fire from 12, 36, or even 72 guns scattered across miles of countryside, all landing on the same target at the same instant. This last technique, the simultaneous arrival of shells fired from different positions at slightly different times, was called time on target. The mathematics were not new. The discipline of executing it under combat conditions was. American gunners practiced it relentlessly. By 1944, an entire corps of artillery, more than 200 guns, could be brought down on a single map square inside of 2 minutes. Major General Raymond Barton, who commanded the 4th Infantry Division, said it plainly after the war. He said he had repeatedly told his men that it was more a matter of the infantry supporting the artillery than the artillery supporting the infantry. He added, "I wish I knew the countless times that positions were taken or held due solely to time-on-target fires. To feed those fire direction centers with targets, the Americans had built another quiet revolution, the eyes in the sky." Above almost every American division flew a small, slow, fabric-covered observation aircraft, the Piper L-4, Grasshopper. 22 feet long, 35 feet across the wings, weighing less than 700 pounds empty. The pilot and his observer sat in canvas seats with a map on their knees and a radio at the elbow. From 2,000 feet up, on a clear day, they could see a German tank column kicking up dust at 20 miles, and they could put a battalion of 155s onto that column before the first vehicle reached the next bend in the road. A German prisoner captured later in the campaign, when asked what frightened him most about American operations, gave an answer that has been quoted many times in unit histories of the airborne artillery. He said, "When the Cub flies over, all things cease. All we move are our eyeballs." There was more. The Americans had brought to Europe a microwave gun-laying radar, the SCR-584, developed by the Radiation Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and built in volume by Chrysler, General Electric, and Westinghouse. It could detect and track artillery shells in flight, calculating from their trajectories the location of the German guns that fired them. Sound and flash-ranging units, organized into specialized field artillery observation battalions, listened for muzzle reports and watched for muzzle flashes, fixing enemy battery positions by triangulation. Forward observers on the ground carried multiple redundant radios, the SCR-300 backpack, the larger SCR-610 and SCR-619 sets, supplemented by miles of telephone wire run forward into the Foxhole line. If the Germans jammed one channel, 3 more were already running. And finally, in the strictest secrecy, there was the device that General Patton would call the funny fuse, the proximity fuse. Its development began in 1940, in a Washington laboratory at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, under a young physicist named Dr. Merle Tuve. The British, working independently, shared their preliminary research with the Americans during the Tizard mission in September of 1940. Tuve's team, designated Section T of the National Defense Research Committee, took the idea and made it real. By 1942, the work had moved to the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. The fuse itself was a miracle of miniaturization. Inside the nose of an artillery shell, scientists had crammed a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, a battery activated by the spinning of the projectile, and vacuum tubes ruggedized to survive the 5,000 Get acceleration of being fired from a gun. The shell broadcast a continuous radio signal as it flew. When that signal bounced back from the ground or from a target with sufficient strength, indicating that the shell was within roughly 20 to 70 feet of impact, the fuse triggered the burst. The shell exploded in the air, above the heads of the enemy, raining shrapnel down into foxholes that no flat trajectory shell could reach. It was first used in combat at sea, on January 5, 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena off Guadalcanal brought down a Japanese dive bomber with one of the first proximity-fused anti-aircraft rounds ever fired in anger. It was used over England against the V-1 flying bombs starting in June of 1944. But for years, the United States and Britain had refused to allow the fuse to be fired over land where a dud might be recovered, reverse-engineered, and turned against Allied bombers. By late 1944, the combined chiefs of staff had approved limited use over land. General Eisenhower formally requested unrestricted ground use on December 19, 1944, 3 days into the German offensive in the Ardennes. The remaining restrictions were lifted within days. 22 million proximity fuses were eventually produced by more than 100 American firms. By the end of the bulge, hundreds of thousands of them would be fired into the snow forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. This, then, was the American artillery system, as the autumn of 1944 turned to winter. Not just guns, but a network. A nervous system reaching from a Piper Cub at 2,000 feet, through a fire direction center in a farmhouse cellar, to the breeches of 72 cannons scattered across the cold hills, all of them aimed at a single Wehrmacht command post that had not yet realized it had been seen. The strategic situation that brought this system to its winter test was grim. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, the great pursuit across France had ended in exhaustion. Antwerp, the port the Allies needed, did not open until late November. The Hürtgen Forest, on the German border south of Aachen, had become a month-long meat grinder for American infantry divisions thrown against fortified ridges and dense fir trees. By the time the cold weather settled in, Eisenhower's broad front strategy had stretched supply lines to the limit. The Germans, for their part, had reached the bottom of the manpower barrel. New formations called Volksgrenadier divisions were thrown together from 16- and 17-year-old boys, men in their 50s and 60s, surplus sailors and airmen, and convalescents from hospitals across the Reich. Hitler approved the plan that would become the Ardennes Offensive in September of 1944. He named it Operation Watch on the Rhine. 3 German armies would mass in secret in the wooded hills opposite the thinly held American Ardennes sector, then drive west through the snow toward Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies and forcing a negotiated peace. The northern shoulder of the attack was given to the 6th Panzer Army under SS General Sepp Dietrich, with 4 SS Panzer divisions and 5 Volksgrenadier divisions. The centre belonged to General Hasso von Manteuffel and the 5th Panzer Army, headed for Brussels by way of St. Vith and Bastogne. The southern flank was held by General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army. Roughly 410,000 men, 1,400 armoured vehicles, and 2,600 guns would take part. The Germans counted on bad weather to ground the American air forces, on surprise to overrun American fuel dumps, and on speed to reach the Meuse River before the Allies could react. By mid-December of 1944, German meteorologists had delivered the forecast Hitler had been waiting for. a window of thick fog and heavy snow lasting at least a week, with little chance for Allied air operations. For the American soldiers who held the long, quiet line in the Ardennes that week, life had become almost peaceful. The sector had a nickname, the Ghost Front. It was where the United States First Army sent newly arrived divisions to learn the ropes, and where battered units came to rest. The 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, had reached the line only days before, moving into position on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge in the second week of December. They were green, untested, and stretched thinly across that exposed high ground. The 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, was recovering from the Hurtgen Forest. The 4th Infantry Division was rebuilding from the same nightmare. The 99th Infantry Division, the Battle Babies, held a 22-mile front with no real reserves. Many of the men were anticipating a USO show featuring Marlene Dietrich. They expected Christmas to come and the war to be over by spring. The temperature on the morning of December 16, 1944, in the northern Ardennes hovered somewhere around 10 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. From late December into January, the average minimum temperature along the front lines was about 22 degrees Fahrenheit, the average maximum a little above freezing. In short bursts, the cold reached well below zero. American medical officers eventually counted somewhere between 46,000 and 71,000 cold weather casualties during that winter: frostbite, trench foot, and hypothermia. More than the total American battle dead in many a smaller war. There were small clues that something was coming. Patrols heard engine noises that should not have been there. Civilians and the occasional German deserter passed warnings of new troop concentrations across the lines. The intelligence picture was contested. The 12th Army Group's intelligence chief, Brigadier General Edwin Siebert, leaned toward the view that Germany was no longer capable of a major offensive in the West. His First Army counterpart, Colonel Benjamin Dixon, warned that something was coming. At Supreme Headquarters, Major General Kenneth Strong voiced his own concerns. The dominant assessment, however, dismissed the danger. The Germans, meanwhile, had imposed strict radio silence across the build-up. They moved their guns at night under tarpaulins. They laid straw on the roads to muffle the hooves of horses. They flew low aircraft along the Rhine to mask the noise of tractors hauling artillery into position. The deception worked. Into this cold and quiet, at 05:30 hours on December 16, the German barrage fell. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Devine's 14th Cavalry Group took the brunt of the breakthrough in the Lochheim Gap. To the south, the 4th Infantry Division's regiments along the Sauer were struck near Echternach. The 28th Infantry Division was hit along the Auer River. The 106th was rolled up on the Schnee-Eifel by a pincer that would force the surrender of 2 of its 3 regiments within days, the largest American mass capture in Europe during the entire war. Some of the smallest American units on the line that morning fought hardest. At the Belgian crossroads village of Lanzerath, an 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 394th Infantry Regiment, led by First Lieutenant Lyle Bauck, joined briefly by a 4-man artillery forward observer team, held its position against an entire battalion of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. They fought from a single line of foxholes for the entire daylight of December 16. German records confirm at least 92 casualties, 16 killed and many more wounded, before the platoon was finally overrun at sunset. Decades after the war, Bauck's men were collectively awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, and Bauck himself received the Distinguished Service Cross. To the north of them, in front of the village of Krinkelt, Technical Sergeant Vernon McGarity of Company L, 393rd Infantry Regiment of the 99th Division, fought a 2-day delaying action with a small group of riflemen against repeated German attacks. Wounded, out of ammunition, and finally surrounded, McGarity and his men held until the last cartridge was gone. He received the Medal of Honor in recognition of those 2 days, his citation announced by general order in January of 1946. But on the northern shoulder, on a place called Elsenborn Ridge, the picture was different. There, by accident as much as design, the Americans had concentrated artillery on a scale the German planners had not anticipated. The 5 Corps Artillery, commanded by Brigadier General Charles Hart and operating under the 5 Corps headquarters of Major General Leonard Guerreau, brought together the divisional artillery of the 99th, the 2nd, the 1st, and eventually the 9th Infantry Divisions. Behind them stood corps-level battalions of 155s and 8-inch howitzers, supported by heavier pieces, including 240mm Black Dragons, drawn from the corps artillery groups in the area. For 10 days, Sepp Dietrich's 1st SS Panzer Corps hurled the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, and the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division at the American line. For 10 days, the American gunners answered with massed concentrations, the like of which the Wehrmacht had never seen on the Western Front. On December 22, 1944, the artillery of the 1st Infantry Division alone, the Big Red One, supporting the 26th Infantry Regiment, dug in at Dom Butgenbach, fired 10,000 rounds in a single day. They fired through fog and into the snow, breaking up attack after attack by the 12th SS Panzer Division. When the snow melted weeks later, soldiers walking the ground in front of the 26th Regiment counted 782 German dead. The 3rd Panzergrenadier Division lost roughly 15 assault guns in a single day to a combination of mud, mines, and the same massed artillery, struck while struggling across soft, churned ground in front of the ridge. On December 26, when the 246th Volksgrenadier Division launched what was meant to be a fresh assault, the attack was, in the words of the United States Army's own official history, scythed down virtually at the moment of its start. The American historian Hugh Cole concluded that the artillery concentration of a whole American corps had made the Elsenborn Ridge position virtually unassailable. It was also at Elsenborn that the proximity fuse, fired against German troops in mass, came truly into its own. American gunners reported watching enemy infantry attack across the snow under what looked like clear sky and then vanish under sudden, unexplained airbursts. The shells were detonating 20 to 30 feet above the German formations, scattering shrapnel down into men who had thought themselves safe in shallow snow scrapes and behind low walls. Bazooka rounds fired from rooftops in the villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, combined with proximity, fuse airbursts in the streets, turned house to house, fighting into a lethal rain of splinters from above. To the south, on the road junction town of Bastogne, a different kind of artillery fight was underway. The town sat on a hub of 7 roads through the Ardennes, and Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army needed those roads. The defence fell to the 101st Airborne Division, rushed forward in trucks from Reims, supported by Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, Combat Command R of the 9th Armoured Division, and the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Acting division commander, because Major General Maxwell Taylor was attending a staff conference in Washington, was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He had graduated from West Point in 1918. Like McNair, he was an artilleryman by training, the Airborne Division's regular artillery commander. The men called him Old Croc. Inside the Bastogne perimeter, by December 21, McAuliffe had 7 artillery battalions, the 321st and the 907th Glider Field Artillery, the 377th and the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery, the 420th Armoured Field Artillery from the 10th Armoured Division, and, crucially, 2 segregated African-American battalions from corps-level reserves. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, with its 155s, and the surviving guns and men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, also 155s, who had been overrun on the first day of the offensive, but who had brought their remaining tubes to Bastogne to keep fighting. By December 22, ammunition was running so low that artillery in Bastogne was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. The town itself was under continuous shell fire from German guns that kept moving to avoid counter-battery fires. The Luftwaffe bombed Bastogne on Christmas Eve, killing American soldiers and Belgian civilians in the streets and field hospital alike. That same morning of December 22, 2 German officers under a white flag, accompanied by an enlisted man, walked up to Company F of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment at the southern edge of Bastogne. They carried a written demand for the honourable surrender of the encircled American garrison. The note was passed up the chain to McAuliffe. He read it and snapped, "Oh, nuts." Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, his operations officer, suggested that this would do as the official answer. McAuliffe agreed. The reply was typed up. A single word. Nuts. Private. First class. Ernest Premetz, a medic who spoke German, translated it for the German negotiators as, "Go to hell." The skies over Bastogne broke clear on December 23. On 4 of the next 5 days, the 9th Troop Carrier Command's C-47 transports parachuted ammunition and medical supplies into the perimeter. McAuliffe's gunners suddenly had shells again. The Bastogne perimeter held. On the afternoon of December 26, the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armoured Division, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, broke through the German ring at the village of Assenois. McAuliffe walked forward to meet the relief force. By all accounts, he greeted them warmly, with words to the effect of, "I am mighty glad to see you." But the most haunting artillery story of the Bulge belongs to a unit whose name almost no one knew until decades after the war. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was a segregated African-American unit, with white officers and black enlisted men, activated at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, in 1942. They had landed in Normandy in late June of 1944. By the autumn, they were attached to the 8th Corps Artillery, in position behind the 106th Infantry Division on the Schnee Eifel. When the German offensive struck on December 16, the 333rd was about 11 miles behind the front. Service Battery sat west of the Auer River. Batteries A, B, and C sat east of it, supporting the doomed regiments of the 106th. By the 17th, the German advance had reached the village of Schonberg, and Battery C and Service Battery were overrun. By the time the battalion's accounts were closed, 6 officers, including the battalion commander, and more than 200 enlisted men, had been killed, captured, or were missing. 9 howitzers were lost. It was the highest casualty rate of any artillery unit in the 8th Corps. The survivors were folded into the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, and they fought on, all the way through the siege of Bastogne. The 969th was eventually awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the first such honor given to an African-American combat unit in United States Army history. But on the afternoon of December 17, 11 of the men who had escaped Schonberg were not yet inside any safe perimeter. They had walked roughly 10 miles through the snow into the German-speaking Belgian hamlet of Wereth. A farmer, named Matthias Langer, with his wife Maria, took them in and gave them food. A neighbor, sympathetic to the Germans, reported their presence. A small patrol drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, long associated with Kampfgruppe Knittel and identified in more recent research as men from the division's reconnaissance battalion, came to the farmhouse. The 11 Americans surrendered without resistance. They were marched out into a snow-covered field at the edge of the village. There, at nightfall, they were murdered. When the snow melted in February, an American graves registration team recovered their bodies. The medical examination documented signs of beating and bayonet wounds inflicted before and after death, evidence that the men had been abused before being shot. The official war crimes investigation was classified secret, and it was closed in 1948, without identifying any of the perpetrators. The 11 men were Curtis Adams of South Carolina, Mager Bradley of Mississippi, George Davis Jr. of Alabama, Thomas Forte of Mississippi, Robert Greene of Georgia, James Leatherwood of Mississippi, Nathaniel Moss of Texas, George Moten of Texas, William Pritchett of Alabama, James Stewart of West Virginia, and Dew Turner of Arkansas. Their story remained almost completely forgotten until 1994, when Herman Langer, the son of the farmer who had hidden them, raised a simple stone cross at the edge of the field where they had died. The success of American artillery during the Bulge winter was not, in the end, the result of any single weapon. It was the product of every piece of the system working together. The first reason the Germans could not hide was simple physics. The proximity fuse turned cover and concealment, 2 of the soldiers' oldest friends, into illusions. A foxhole protects you from shell fragments traveling sideways at chest level. It does almost nothing against a shell that bursts 20 feet directly overhead. By the end of the Bulge, an American battalion fire mission with proximity-fused shells could effectively reach down into trenches, behind walls, and onto reverse slopes that no flat-impact shell could touch. The second reason was a related horror unique to the wooded country of the Ardennes, the Hurtgen, and the Vosges. The tree burst. Conventional impact and delay fuses, fired into a forest canopy, detonated against the trunks and limbs of fir and hardwood 30 or 50 feet up. Splinters of wood, often as deadly as steel, rained down with the shrapnel. The American war correspondent Ernest Hemingway, who reported from the Hurtgen with the 22nd Infantry Regiment, called the fighting there Passchendaele, with tree bursts. Colonel Charles Lanham, who commanded the 22nd, put it more bluntly. He said, "Up there, it was our troops who combed the tree bursts out of their hair while the Kraut lay snug in his hole. When American gunners began doing it back to the Germans in the Bulge, the effect was annihilating." The third reason was the fire direction center system itself. A German battery, even a well-trained one, generally fought as part of a regiment, with each battalion shooting its own missions. An American battery shot whatever the Corps fire direction net told it to shoot, on a target it had never registered, at a coordinate it had never seen. Often within 5 to 10 minutes of a request from a forward observer, it had never met. The result was a flexibility of mass that the Wehrmacht could not match. 12 guns, 36 guns, 72 guns. The phrase used in training was a serenade by an entire corps, every shell timed to land within seconds of every other shell, was an event the survivor of which usually never forgot. The fourth reason was that American eyes were everywhere. The L4 Grasshopper, slow and fragile though it was, gave every division a roving observation post that the Germans simply could not duplicate in winter weather. On the first day of the Bulge, only a handful of L4s managed to get airborne in the heavy fog. Within 2 weeks, when the skies cleared, hundreds of them were up. American liaison pilots compacted snow on improvised airstrips by taxiing back and forth across them. Some Cubs were even fitted with skis to operate from frozen meadows in Belgium that winter. The fifth reason was that the American counter-battery network worked. The SCR-584 radar tracked German shells in flight back to their firing positions. Sound and flash-ranging units fixed muzzle reports across the snow. The result was that any German battery that fired more than a few rounds from one place became, almost immediately, a target itself. German artillerymen learned to shoot and move, but moving a horse-drawn 105mm battery through Ardennes mud and snow was not a fast operation, and the Americans were faster. The sixth reason was logistical. The United States in 1944 was producing artillery shells on a scale no other combatant could match. The 105mm high-explosive round was the most fired field artillery shell in the United States Army's arsenal. American factories built more than 8,500 meters too. A-1 howitzers and produced shells for them in such numbers that even the Bastogne ration of 10 rounds per gun per day, treated as a near disaster at the time, would have been an unimaginable luxury for many a German battery in the same week. And finally, the seventh reason was the human network. The forward observer was not, in the American system, a junior afterthought. He was often a young officer with a radio, a map, a pair of binoculars, and the authority to bring an entire battalion's fire down inside 200 yards of his own foxhole. Across the snow forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, the unsung heroes of the Bulge were the lieutenants and sergeants who walked forward into the German line, called grid coordinates over a hand-cranked radio, and did not flinch when the first ranging round walked toward them. This pattern was not new in 1944. The Americans had been refining it through the autumn campaigns. In the Hurtgen Forest from September to mid-December, the 22nd Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Lanham, took roughly 2,700 to 2,800 casualties, advancing about 6,000 yards in 18 days, around 86% of its rifle strength. To break the village of Groschau in early December, multiple American artillery battalions, ranging from 105mm to 240mm pieces, fired in succession into a hamlet of perhaps 300 buildings. By the time the 22nd walked in, very little of Groschau still stood. By the eve of the Bulge, total American battle and non-battle casualties along the Siegfried Line ran into the tens of thousands. The pattern continued through the winter. In the Vosges Mountains and the Colmar Pocket, in late January and early February of 1945, the United States Seventh Army and the First French Army applied the same fire direction center, time on target, and proximity fuse methods, and ground their way through one of the last German strongholds west of the Rhine. On February 23, 1945, when the United States Ninth Army crossed the Roer River in Operation Grenade, The assault was preceded by a 45-minute Army-level artillery preparation involving more than 1,000 guns. By spring, the technique was no longer remarkable. It was simply how the United States Army fought. When the war ended, the German generals who had directed Operation Watch on the Rhine were captured, interrogated, and asked to explain what had gone wrong. Their answers, preserved in the Foreign Military Studies series compiled by the United States Army Historical Division, return again and again to the same theme. The American artillery. Hasso von Manteuffel, after the war, wrote letters and gave interviews about the defense of St. Vith. In a 1964 exchange with Brigadier General Bruce Clark, whose 7th Armored Division had organized the defense, he admitted that German command had estimated they faced an entire American corps at St. Vith. In fact, Clark had improvised his line out of the wreckage of the 106th and the 28th, and a small handful of armor. Manteuffel called the delaying action there decisive for the failure of his drive, and a serious complication for the 6th SS Panzer Army to his north. The reason was not the number of American riflemen on the ground, it was the weight of fire those riflemen could call down on every approach road. Sepp Dietrich, in his post-war captivity, complained about almost everything, about Hitler, about fuel, about the weather. He said little useful about American fire support. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, asked to summarize the offensive, gave a single line. All, absolutely all conditions for the possible success of such an offensive were lacking. He did not need to specify which conditions. American gunners would have understood. In the autumn of 1945, after Japan surrendered, the United States and Britain finally lifted the secrecy on the proximity fuse. Admiral Lewis Strauss, who had overseen the Navy's part of the program, said publicly that while no one invention won the war, the proximity fuse had to be listed among the very small group of developments, like radar, upon which victory very largely depended. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called it a weapon that had helped blaze the trail to Japan. The Army's official historians would caution, in the years that followed, that the fuse, although devastating where used, was only one piece of a much larger system. In the decades since, the artifacts of that winter have settled into a quieter life. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where Leslie McNair's reformers built the doctrine that defeated Watch on the Rhine, the United States Army Field Artillery Museum displays the M2A1 howitzer, the M1 Long Tom, the 8-inch howitzer, and the towering Black Dragon 240mm piece, restored and silent under the Oklahoma sun. At the Bastogne War Museum in Belgium, opened in 2014, M4 Sherman tanks, M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, and 105mm pieces stand among the displays of paratroopers' helmets and frozen ration tins. Outside the town, the Madison Memorial, dedicated on July 16, 1950, lifts its star-shaped granite arms over the Ardennes Plateau and names the American states whose sons fought there. In a small Belgian field on the edge of the village of Wereth, a granite memorial dedicated on May 23, 2004, lists 11 names. Curtis Adams, Major Bradley, George Davis Jr., Thomas Forte, Robert Greene, James Leatherwood, Nathaniel Moss, George Moten, William Pritchett, James Stewart, Dew Turner. It was the first memorial in Europe to black American soldiers of the Second World War. 7 of the 11 now rest at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in eastern Belgium. The other 4 were brought home to grieving families in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge, organized after the war into a national association, gathered for decades on every December 16th at Madison, at Bastogne, at Elsenborn, and at Wereth. Each year, fewer of them have come. The men who carried radios into the snow at Krinkelt, who flew cubs over the fog of the Schnee Eifel, who served the breaches of the M2A1s at Dom Butgenbach, are now nearly all gone. What remains is the documentary record, Hugh Cole's Official Army History of the Ardennes, published by the Center of Military History in 1965. Charles MacDonald's A Time for Trumpets, published in 1985. Boyd Dastrup's branch history of the field artillery, titled, fittingly, King of Battle. Ralph Baldwin's history of the proximity fuse, the deadly fuse. Together, they preserve what the soldiers themselves once carried. Why does this story matter, 80 years on? Why should anyone remember the difference between an M1 Long Tom and an M115? or what a fire direction center actually did, or how a young physicist in a Washington laboratory dreamed up a radio inside a shell. The answer is not really about technology. It is about the kind of war the United States chose to fight, and the price its enemies paid for choosing to fight a different one. The German High Command, in the autumn of 1944, had made a calculation. They believed that bad weather, surprise, and the hardihood of their own soldiers could overwhelm a richer, slower, more cautious enemy. They believed the Ardennes forest would shield their tanks from American eyes. They believed the snow and the fog were on their side. They were wrong on all three counts. Not because the American soldier was uniquely brave, though many of them were brave beyond reasonable measure, but because, behind every American rifleman in a foxhole at Elsenborn or Bastogne, stood a system of guns, of radios, of fire direction centers, of liaison aircraft, of factories in Detroit and Cleveland, of laboratories in Washington and Baltimore, of training schools in Oklahoma. A system patient enough, accurate enough, and large enough that no winter forest could swallow a German column whole. The Germans who survived that winter remembered it the rest of their lives. They remembered shells that fell from a sky they could not see. They remembered the small, quiet airplane circling at 2,000 feet that made every column halt in place. They remembered the night at the Sauer River, when 702 of their comrades died in a single concentration without ever firing a shot in return. They remembered, above all, the feeling that someone, somewhere, was always watching the snow. 8 decades later, the Field Artillery Branch of the United States Army still calls itself the King of Battle. The phrase predates the Second World War. But it earned a new meaning in the winter of 1944, when the king came down out of the laboratories and the training schools and the factories and laid claim, for one cold and decisive season, to the Ardennes. The lesson worth carrying away is not that any one weapon won the war, not even the funny fuse, which Patton credited so generously. It is that an army, like a civilization, is only as strong as the connections it can make under pressure, between the boy with a radio in a snow-covered foxhole and the physicist in a heated laboratory, between the corporal at the breech of a 105mm howitzer and the lieutenant in a slow yellow airplane, between the men who designed a system in 1930s, Oklahoma, and the men who lived inside that system on a Belgian ridge in 1944. The German soldier in the Ardennes that winter could not hide because, when the fog lifted on his small piece of forest, he discovered that he was not facing a single enemy. He was facing a network. And the network had been built, quietly and without fanfare, while he had been told to expect a quick and easy war. By the time he understood what he was up against, the snow above his position was already lit with the soft, low flashes of airbursts he had never been taught to fear. And then there was no more time to learn. Remember them. The 702 unnamed German soldiers caught at the Sauer River. The German tank crews caught in the open at Bastogne and Dom-Butgenbach. The young American forward observers who walked forward into that white country with a radio and a map. The 11 men of the 333rd who lay through the winter in a Belgian field until a farmer's son raised a cross over them. Remember the cooks and the wire teams and the meteorologists and the L4 pilots and the laboratory technicians who soldered miniature vacuum tubes onto fuses by the millions. Remember Leslie McNair, who never lived to see his system tested, and Anthony McAuliffe, who did, and answered a German surrender demand with a single word. Remember them all. They were the network. And the network, in the worst winter of the war, did not fail.